Red Cave Podcast. Reading tonight from Tales from the Cracks, numbers 48 through 50. Starting with Deer Season. Followed by Bloody Mary, I Am Your Child. And concluded with I Dream in Black and Light. There is snow on the ground, and the valleys are cold, and a midnight profound blackly squats over the wold. But a light on the hilltops half seen, hints of feastings unhallowed and old. There is death in the clouds, there is fear in the night. For the dead in their shrouds hail the sins turning flight, and chant wild in the woods as they dance round a Yule altar, fungus and white. To no gale of earth's kind sways the forest of oak, where the sick boughs entwined by mad mistletoes choke. For those powers are the powers of the dark, from the graves of the lost druid folk. H.P. Lovecraft. Deer Season. It was deer season in Neil's sleepy rural town, which left him very few options as a regular hiker. Moving to the northern country landscape of Georgia was a no-brainer for someone like him, who required at least 3 hours of every afternoon to recatalog his thoughts, blow off the accumulated stress of the day, and get the creative juices flowing as a writer. This daily regiment became such a necessity for him, with his freelance job as a travel columnist for a local magazine, that if he didn't get out in the fresh air, rain or shine, for his required 3 hours, he would spend the rest of the evening staring at a blank computer screen and thinking up excuses to push back his story deadline another couple days. This routine was so tried and tested that when it came time to shop for new apartments, a moderate to difficult hiking trail within 15 minutes of his front door jumped to the top of his pro and con list, above washer or dryer or security detail. After moving to the Blue Ridge Mountains of Georgia, he spent his spring, summer, and winter navigating his favorite trail in his backyard, which he visited without fail every day, to the point where the squirrels came to know him and ceased bothering to scurry up the trees to escape his eye. It became a rare trend for any of his writing assignments to make it in late to his lead editor's desk, and he remained fit and full of energy. And then deer season came along, and his favorite trail was suddenly locked down with a gate and padlock. Most disappointing of all was the fact that this was fall, unarguably the most seasonal time of year for hiking. His first thought was that there was still plenty of room to squeeze through the gap in the gate or step over the chain. However, the thought of crunching down a dead, silent trail with all the unknown gun sights swinging around the screen of trees was enough to cause hesitation. He wasn't wearing bright colors for one thing, and he didn't think he owned any sort of clothing that would help him stand out from his background. It wasn't worth the risk, even though he thought it common sense that any hunter would hear him coming a mile away and know the difference between his haphazard steps and the graceful, stilt-like strides of a deer. Still, just imagining his own image in the crosshairs of a scope, even for a moment, while a hunter's finger was poised on a trigger, was enough to turn him away. For the first time in his life, he was actually thinking about joining a gym, but a part of him knew that his creative juices were triggered by the fresh air and sunlight as much as the cardio stimulation. So he looked up the other trails in the area and could find very few that didn't cut through the designated deer hunting blocks. All except one. He found this one after scrolling through satellite images of the acres to the north, south, east, and west of his favorite hiking spot. He could see the gravel trail winding up the hillsides of pine and pecan trees. But when he cross-referenced the coordinates with his trusty search engines, he couldn't find information on any of the previous owners or whether it was government land. It looked to be overgrown from what he could see, and there were certainly sections of fence separating it from the designated hunting grounds, which at least told him he could navigate the land freely without a target on his back. In actuality, this was all he was really looking for. However, trespassing on someone's private property introduced the same kind of issue, as it was legal in that state to shoot anyone on sight on your land if you were not invited. And then he saw that a section of the trail looped outside of the fence along a 3-mile stretch up and down the countryside. And he followed the course with his mouse cursor. Recording the coordinates, he was able to conclude that he could access the entrance to this path a half a mile from his usual trailhead, and by going off trail, he would be navigating outside of the hunting section. This all seemed doable to him, and he was ready to seek out the trail that day. It would require some backtracking, as the trail did not loop back to the starting point, but he thought that a fair compromise. As he plotted his course on his phone's GPS, he detected a structure captured in the satellite image that looked like the top of a complex, minus the rooftop. Thus, it resembled a winding maze. Looking down from above, and he had to wonder who had built a complex. It looked military in formation, but it was as overgrown as the trail, and he had to conclude that it hadn't seen a caretaker in some time. There was no doubt in his mind that he was peeking beyond the curtain into someone's private property, intended to be sanctioned off from public scrutiny. But was it still operational? He could not be sure. The trail continued straight into the heart of the man-made labyrinth, and he figured he would decide when he got there whether it was safe enough to push further. From what he could see, a chest-high fence separated that property from the public trail, which wouldn't be too difficult to hop if he had enough conviction. And it didn't take him long to find the trail, as his plotted course on his phone led him directly to a natural clearing of sorts, where the distant cannon of gunfire at his back did little to set him at ease. He kept an eye out for ticks in the tall grass as he blazed his own trail, using his phone as his compass. He was thankful that he had taken a screenshot of his makeshift map, as there was no cell signal out there in the boonies. There was the mouth of the gravel path, as the computer had predicted, with weeds growing wild from the center, but 2 tracks were still visible, evenly spread apart, as if a cart or train had once wound up the mountain from that spot. Neil gratefully followed, flattening the grass in the center of the trail as he went so that it would be easier to follow back to the clearing. And soon he had replaced his sunglasses with a stocking cap. As he was in the trees now, he breathed deeply through his nostrils and became lost in thought, thinking on his own writing assignment for the magazine, which he thought would center on off-trail navigation through the woods, including survival tips and tricks for safe navigation. Write what you know, he'd always been told. It was quite common for him to lose track of the time when he was brainstorming as he was, and that was exactly what happened. He looked up from his feet, and he saw that the private property sign served as a wall directly in front of him. A caveat followed this, claiming that violators would be shot on sight, and the fence looked much gnarlier in person than it did on his computer screen. It was wrapped in razor wire, and it was higher than chest height, now at about his chin. The trail curved slightly and ran parallel with the fence for a stretch longer, so he took it, attempting to glimpse over the top of the fence post as he went. He couldn't see the complex of labyrinthian walls from his vantage point, but he knew they weren't too far away, as if the builders knew they had to maximize the space and extend the complex as far to the fence boundary lines as possible. Then he came to the final dead end, where the fence cut across the trail. Neil wondered what had come first, the fence or the trail, and he had his answer as soon as he came in for a closer look. There was a padlock and swinging gate built into the fence, also covered in rusty barbs. At one time, a passing vehicle could have pushed the gate open on its now hardened hinges and continued on into the private property. Perhaps if he had some bolt cutters or a simple ladder, he could do some exploring, but he had already hiked his 3 miles, and another 3 down the mountain seemed apt enough to finish the narrative he was constructing in his head. But as he turned from the gate, he heard a man scream out, and he looked further down, following the line of the fence into a clutch of bramble bushes at a clear human figure sticking half in and out of the gap between 2 of the fence posts. The barbed wire had all been peeled away and stuck flat to the fence with a piece of particle board, which had probably given the man the freedom to wriggle as far as he did through the slit. He was wearing a gray uniform, soiled and partly shredded from the barbs, and he was emaciated, swimming in his clothes, with patches of hair on the top of his skull. He had one arm free on Neil's side of the fence, along with his head, whereas the other half of his body was clearly wedged on the other side. He screamed for help, waving Neil closer, but he was careful not to raise his voice too loudly. His calls came across as forced and hushed. Neil hesitated from his place on the trail, but he was able to drop his guard slightly when he found the source of the emergency. A bracelet around the man's wrist, located on the restricted part of the fence, was caught on the fence post. "Are you stuck?" Neil ventured to ask. The man nodded his oversized head vigorously, and Neil had to wonder how he'd squeezed such a melon through that fence. As if reading his mind, the man explained as calmly as he could. "I was trying to get on the other side of this fence. I was on that trail like you. I just wanted to see what was over there. I only got halfway through, but my arm got caught." "You've never been on the other side?" Neil continued. "No, this was my first time out here." "But the particle board," Neil said. He noticed that it was on the other side of the fence. "I found that out here and positioned it over on that side." This seemed believable enough, but he still didn't move from his spot to help the man. "Come on and help me get free," the man hissed, more commanding than before. "What are you wearing there?" Neil asked. "It's my work uniform," the man said, without skipping a beat. "I work in the concrete factory down the way. This is my lunch break." "And why did you decide to come out here?" "Why are you here?" he shot back, which caught Neil off guard. "I just wanted to see where this trail goes. Now I couldn't care less, as I've been stuck like this for 2 hours. "What's that around your wrist?" It didn't look to be a bracelet or handcuff of any kind Neil had seen before. It was metal in composition, and it was tight around the wrists. So tight that it looked like the man's arm was broken, hanging loosely and in a twisted angle against the fence post. "I think I broke my wrist trying to wrench free," the man said. "I can almost squeeze through now, but it's so painful. I just need your help pushing this bracelet up and out from the post. It'll only take a second, man. I may die out here if not. My vision's already starting to cloud." "All right, 1 second," Neil said, stepping over a tangled root to approach the fence. "Thank God you came by, man." Neil watched as the man used his free hand to brace his weight against the bough of a nearby tree. His other arm was clearly crippled, so Neil felt comfortable enough to square up with the man and reach in through the gap in the fence to touch the cold steel of the bracelet. It was smooth and highly polished, so that he could see his reflection in the steel. "You didn't tell me what this bracelet is," Neil said. "It's a little embarrassing, but it's my probation bracelet," the man said matter-of-factly. "I've had a few too many DUIs, and this will alert the police if I leave their jurisdiction. It will also alarm once I'm out of it, but this seems like a life-or-death kind of situation." "Damn, it's really wedged in there," Neil huffed as he grabbed it with both of his hands. "Get your fingers in there. Use them as a brace against my own wrist. I'll have to squeeze out." Neil did as he was instructed and wrapped his fingers around the underside of the bracelet, pushing the back of his hand against the man's bruised flesh. The man groaned in pain, and Neil in turn squeezed more of his hand through the bracelet, pulling as hard as he could, and then he felt something shift, where the bracelet suddenly cracked open, expanding just enough for the man to slip free and collect on his knees in the grass. But the bracelet quickly clamped down on Neil's hand, still pinning him to the fence post. The only free digit was the top of his thumb and a section of his wrist. As he cried out in pain, the man whooped with glee behind him. "What did you do?" Neil roared. "If you ever get free from that post, and that bracelet's still in your hand, I wouldn't try going past this fence," the man said to him seriously, now a safe few steps away. From his new safety zone, he cradled his wounded wrist. "You set me up," Neil cried. "That device around your hand is reactive to your size," the man explained. "It's designed to expand if you gain weight, for instance, and restrict if you lose it. By pushing it to its maximum sensitivity there, we were able to get it open just enough for me to get out. But once it sensed your hand, it compensated and restricted again." "What the hell is this thing?" "It's meant to prevent you from leaving the boundary of this fence," he explained. "I'm from the mental hospital at the top of the hill there. It's a free-range compound, so we're allowed to fend for ourselves for a lot of our sentence, as long as we don't venture too far. I purposefully broke my wrist, hoping I could wriggle out. Otherwise, if you get to the other side of the fence with the bracelet still on, it sends thousands of volts through your body and will fry you on the spot. So I suggest you find a way out of them." "Mental hospital? There's nothing like that listed in this area," Neil argued, yanking harder now on his restraint. "If you know what kind of shit the doctors up there are into, you'd understand why that place isn't advertised." Neil couldn't crane his neck far enough to see, but the man sounded like he was further down the path now, back at the point where Neil had once stood. "I'm really sorry about this, but you know what you need to do to escape. I'd get help, but they can't know I breached the fence. I wish you all the luck." "No, you can't leave me like this. I tried to help you. I saved your life. If you get into the maze, always take the right path," the man yelled further down the path this time. "They can't go right. They can only turn left, and they'll always be right behind you." "No, wait! But he could hear the man's boots crunching with the gravel on his way down the mountain. Neil leaned all his weight forward as far as he could, pushing against the fence post until it felt like it was bending. And with half of his body through the gap, he thrust his hip against the post until he heard a shriek of metal against metal and his wrist was suddenly free, and he was on his hands and knees on the dirt, with the bracelet still fastened across half of his hand. But he was on the restricted side of the fence now. His first thought was that he could easily slide through the slit, especially with the fence posts bent away. But the man had warned him that the bracelet would electrocute him if he carried it past the boundary line. He didn't feel confident enough to test the truth of his words. If it was true what he said, he was a mental patient in a hospital, so it was unclear if any of his statements could be taken as gospel. He had lied to him almost too casually to ignore when they first laid eyes on each other, but looking at the piece of equipment on his wrist, he could confirm that it was unlike any kind of bracelet he'd ever seen. It had appeared to open and close on its own accord, as the man had described, so what else could it do? Neil decided that he didn't want to find out, but maybe he could find something to break the bracelet with, as he wasn't quite ready to snap his own wrist to be free of it. But looking at the quickly setting sun in the sky, and trying to ignore the sudden chill on the wind, he wasn't quite prepared for. He wondered how far he might be willing to go in order to be free of the alien piece of technology. Thus he ventured further from the fence, through the trees, and into the clearing. He came upon the opening to the maze of partitioned walls, sticking straight out of the grass like oversized playing cards. The walls were riddled with bullet holes and were stained black with soot or scarred with fire, including what looked like the pockmarks of mortar shells. He could only think now that this was once a training ground for soldiers, as he'd seen on TV or in movie theaters. His first instinct had been right. The government must own this land, or they'd laid claim to it at one time. The man had said that they couldn't take the right-hand path within the maze. Whoever these they were the current owners of this maze. So Neil took his first right into the maze and continued on, until he reached the next bend, and he again took a right, as he was instructed. Further along, he began to notice that the walls all had metal handles built into them, like doorknobs, and he saw a lot of what looked like blood or some dark paint splattering the grass. Neil figured that he could slip the bracelet through one of these handles, like the former owner had done with the fence post. Then maybe he could slip the rest of his hand free, but he began to hear what sounded like footsteps behind him, large, deliberate crunches in the gravel, and not like the military-grade boots the supposed inmate had been wearing on his flight down the mountain. These were long, pronounced heel-toe steps, almost mechanical in their movements. He only stepped long enough to listen and dissect the noises, but the footsteps sounded so alien and close that he could never stop for long. The steps were scraping and prolonged, like the sole of a rubber sandal grinding with sand. When he tried to conjure up an image to accompany these sounds, he was met with the same blockade. Maybe what he was hearing were more inmates like him, weighed heavy by the bracelets on their wrists. Then he reached a dead end, a solid wall. If he wanted to continue forward, that would mean backtracking, and even turning left somewhere along the way. Now the sun had ducked beyond the man-made horizon of these partition walls, and he was lost in the shade. And the footsteps were quickly gaining on him, so close now he could hear the labored breathing of someone, and it sounded like it was coming in closer and closer. If the stranger had been following his same route, then he wouldn't be able to meet him in his dead end, not if he couldn't take the right-hand paths. But it was difficult to determine what path it could be taking, and whether it was coming from the other direction. When the breathing became too much to bear, he pushed up against the barrier in front of him and was surprised to feel it give slightly, like the fence post back at the trail's end. He touched the handle, drilled into the wall, and had his first idea. As per usual, his mind had been working furiously as he hiked, playing out possible scenarios of how to best break his wrist and be done with the bracelet. And now he thought he'd found his answer. Part of him had already been prepared for the pain, so it didn't take much conviction on his part to slip the bracelet onto the handle in the door so that the cold metal was flush against his wrist. Now his bone was braced between the handle and the bracelet, and he counted down from 3 in his head before thrusting his shoulder into the walls once, twice, and then a third time, so that the partition began to sway. And when he caught enough momentum on the other side of the oversized pendulum, he heaved all his weight against the door and followed it into a crashing crescendo forward. Everything happened so fast, rocking and rattling every bone in his body, that he didn't even feel the pain of his broken wrist until he was collected and back on his feet with 2 bare hands and the bracelet hanging uselessly like a ring-tossed toy on the fallen door's handle. Now he was free, and although a brand new course had opened up for him, all he could think to do was go back the way he'd come. Unfortunately, this meant turning left the entire way. At least he knew he had a surefire way out. All he would have to do is follow the left-hand paths back to the trail. This was much more attractive than the thought of stumbling his way to the other end of the maze, and risking more dead ends. And for what? For the unmade promise of another exit at the end of all those passageways? What if there was only a mental hospital on the other side of that acreage, as the former inmate had claimed, run by doctors as unstable as the ill people they imprisoned? He stopped to listen, and he no longer heard any ragged breathing or footfalls. Whoever had been following him had become as quiet as him. The collapsing wall had certainly caught the ear of any living, breathing thing for miles around, and he didn't want to be there when anyone, or anything, came by to check on his unwarranted destruction of property. He collected the bracelet from the handle and followed the wall with a quickening pace, his injured arm tucked protectively against his chest. Although he stopped periodically to listen for any more sounds, he heard nothing but the rustle of trees and his own labored breaths. Then, around one of the last corners, he caught sight of a dark shape out of the corner of his eyes. But it wasn't standing in his intended pathway, but further along the corridor, looking straight his way. He seized up against the wall and caught his weight against one of those handles. The light wasn't good, but he could see that it was a head and shoulder shape with a hood and cloak. But in the fading sunlight, it was unclear if the figure was wearing a wicker mask, or if its face was so characteristically ridged, and it looked to have some kind of dark blinders positioned over its eyes. Thus, even though they were both looking in the same direction, the figure had not noticed Neil, as far as he could tell. It was standing very still, though, head poised to the side, as if listening. The ridges on its face worked thoughtfully. and Neil watched its snout wrinkle with a clear sniff at the air. Below this snout was a muzzle, complete with metal bars, which glinted like chrome teeth in the diminishing sunlight. Neil might have thought the thing was a statue if he hadn't seen it lift a cautious arm, revealing a clawed hand from out the interior of its sleeve. It reached blindly for the nearest handle on the wall, and Neil quickly deduced that was how they navigated the maze without their eyes. And it took a step closer to Neil, testing the gravel with its clawed foot and gaining purchase there before taking the next one. He watched it reach out with the same hand, its bony wrist passing between the handle and the wall like a thread through a needle, before clicking its claws together and grabbing hold. Neil found the nearest handle, just inches from his left elbow, and he attempted to slide the bracelet over the handle so that it was nestled against the wall. That way the thing would reach through the bracelet as well as the handle, but it was so difficult to see that he almost dropped the bracelet, clinking metal against metal, and causing the creature down the path to growl beneath its mask. He heard its robe swish crazily, and its toenails clicking on the ground as it came at him quicker than ever. He was too afraid to turn and look. He fumbled with the bracelet, making sure it would not slip off the handle, before taking off in a dead sprint through the corridors and taking every left corner as if it was his last. And the creature was screaming now behind him, but it didn't sound like it was far, just right around the next bend, keeping even pace with him. He thought about taking a right and testing the truth of the man's words, but he was so close now. He could sense it, and he had never been so happy to see the trees and darkening sky before, now free from the obstructive maze walls. But he couldn't find the section of fence with the razor wire pulled back. He ran well past the point he was sure he'd entered from, but everything looked so different in the dark, and the monster's wheezing was so loud in his ears. The entire forest seemed to fall into a prolonged hush at the presence of this abomination on his heels, and Neil responded with the most primal, ungodly scream he'd ever uttered in his life. Its sound came as such a surprise to him, but not as much as the guttural snarl that came back from his pursuer. His only saving grace in the twilight was the particle board leaning up against the fence, which was a shade of color unlike the rest of his surroundings. He clawed his way through the gap, feeling the bite of the barbs on his stomach and chest as it tore bits of clothing and flesh away. He got halfway through and felt his hip bones snag on the same fence posts he'd battled before. He pushed with all his might until he heard bone grind with the metal, and that was all drowned out by the sounds of kicking gravel as the thundering footsteps skittered to a stop, bracing for an impact with him. He felt the thing's breath on his ear as he slipped free and continued with his forward momentum down the path. He heard the fence clatter, and then there was a heavy thud and vibrations beneath Neil's shoes as the fence posts were no doubt ripped out of the ground. He could even feel the pebbles bounce off the back of his legs as the fence fell inward and collided with the earth. The thing shrieked, and Neil thought it had tangled itself in the barbed wire, and that these were exclamations of pain. But he saw that it was on his side of the fence. But it was writhing, back bent awkwardly, to reveal bare bone ribs poking out from behind the veil of its robes. Neil could see that the shiny bracelet, once attached to his hand, was now clamped on the creature's wrist, and it was electrocuting him. Neil paused long enough to watch smoke emanate from the folds of its robes, now reduced to its knees, with its claws digging in the dirt, and then its head exploded in a spray of red brain matter. And Neil didn't wait to watch its bony body collapse in its robes. He booked it down the trail, thankful to have all his limbs and working legs that could carry him back to civilization. As he ran, he wondered how much of what he now knew could be translated into a believable article for his travel magazine. All he knew for sure was that he was much more confident to brave his usual trail. Deer hunters be damned, but come to think of it, a gym membership didn't sound half bad either. Bloody Mary, I am your child. Jonie crouched down low to the curb, not opening her eyes. She didn't hear any more laughing, but there was far-away crackling that seemed to start in the pit of her ears. Then it stopped altogether, making Jonie relax a bit. She summoned up the remaining shred of her courage and snapped open her eyes in one swift motion. Nothing. The street was empty and she was on the sidewalk. She lifted up her aching body and managed to get to her bloody, bruised feet. The hammer she had dropped was lying in the middle of the street. Jonie whimpered, questioning if it was okay to move from her spot. She decided and quickly limped into the street and snatched up her one source of protection. She shuddered and crossed her arms as a cold breeze lifted and came down across the street. Jonie started to get scared, so she began to return to the curb. Then the breeze twisted and twirled around her in one soulless wisp. Two clear red eyes appeared in front of her, not wielding any kind of facial appearance. Just two thin staring eyes only constructed out of the blowing wind. The eyes seemed to smile at Jonie as if mocking her, drowning her in remorse. Then the laughing started again. The fierce, evil laughter of a woman. It seemed to come from the eyes, as if the black pupils were gaping mouths, reacting to some sick joke. Jonie staggered backwards, arms twirling outwards for balance. The eyes seemed to follow her, though, with every step. Jonie knew exactly whose eyes they were, Bloody Mary's. Somehow Bloody Mary was actually there, in no reliable form in front of her. This, Jonie knew, was not her mental mind constructing this. Bloody Mary was actually there. She had the same feeling of dread on that day in Mary's room in front of her mirror. Jonie screamed, falling backwards. The eyes closed, into nothing, and the ravenous wind blew off into the mini tornado, leaving Jonie lying in the middle of the street. Her chest heaved and her head was spinning. She's getting stronger, Jonie thought. The mirror. Mary's mirror is her transportation. She's getting stronger because of that. The mirror. Let's get back to Black Spruce, Jonie proclaimed, getting back to her feet. Must warn Mary. Then sirens blew through the air like an elephant's roar. Jonie stopped dead in her tracks as patrol cars lined the street and halted at Jonie's feet. Police got out and aimed their handguns carefully at the delirious young girl. Jonie, put down your weapon and step towards me, a broad cop said as he slowly approached Jonie. His gun was in the holster, and that gave Jonie the idea that no force was going to be used. Jonie dropped the murder weapon. So be it. Jonie stepped into the man's arms and handcuffs were casually slapped onto her wrists. The clock struck 9:41. Jonie wrapped her white, bony fingers around the cold steel bars of the jail door. She had been brought down to the Glenwood Springs police station where there was a lone jail cell to keep intoxicated men for the night. But tonight it was to keep a 17-year-old girl. The deputy was sitting behind his assigned desk, feet kicked up, old western leather boots on, and a coffee mug sitting atop a stack of old worthless forms. He looked straight at the girl with interest. A 17-year-old girl, killing her own friend brutally with a hammer? It just didn't seem probable, but it did happen. And that's when Barry's job became an illness. It just made him upset to think about all the evil and loony people there were out there. Sir, what time is it? Jonie asked, worriedly, shivering under the blanket that had been provided her. Girl, please, go to sleep. When you wake up, we'll decide then what to do with you, Barry replied, leaning back his head and closing his eyelids. Please, then I'll sleep. Barry grunted and raised his meaty arm like it was a back-breaking chore. He gazed at his watch intently and then turned his attention back to Jonie. It's 9:56. Now go to bed. He relaxed again into his chair. Jonie stepped back and then racked her brain for some kind of escape plan, but no such plan could ever be constructed. She gave up on that and looked at the wall above Barry's head. A small mirror in the shape of an oval hung from the wall. It was used by police who were around the corner so they could look at the mirror and see the reflection of the cell. It was much easier than completely turning the corner. If there was only some way to smash the glass, but that wasn't a possible plan either. So then she started to plead, beg for her escape. Please, sir, you've got to let me out. If you don't, you could really get hurt, Jonie said desperately. Shut up, Barry yelled without opening his eyes. Please, you have to, Jonie screamed, banging her fists on the bars. Don't make me drug you, girl, Barry said. Jonie fell back into her spring-loaded cot. She hung her head and waited for the time to come. Barry's watch struck 10 o'clock, and immediately a wide crack slashed across the mirror. Barry jumped up from his chair and turned his head towards the mirror, which was now dripping blood. Jonie was staring too, and she skirted to the very edge of the bed, her back resting on the concrete wall. What the? Barry asked fearfully. Then, long, razor-sharp nails dug into his shoulder and pulled him back onto the desk, scattering the paperwork and the full mug of coffee. He looked up and then screamed. A blood-stained woman with a blue flowing gown stood before him. He pulled out his gun with no hesitation, but Bloody Mary was quicker. The blade of her mother's scepter came through the air like a boomerang and separated a piece of Barry's stomach from his waist. Jonie screamed, fingers digging into the wall until her fingernails popped right off her fingers in a string of blood. Bloody Mary turned her head towards the cowering Jonie with her blank white eyes. Her torn purple lips peeled into a breathless smile, revealing black, molding teeth. She laughed quickly, letting black blood drip off her gaping hole of a mouth. Bloody Mary snatched the keys to the cell off the hook without even looking at them. She stopped at the cell door and jammed the key into the keyhole. Jonie stopped screaming now, but terror was still scraping at the walls of her heart. The woman passed through the cell doors and smiled happily down upon Jonie. I've waited a long time for this, Bloody Mary began, but her dead, dreary voice kept trailing off and coming back into focus again. Jonie cocked her head upwards as Bloody Mary's bleeding hands brought up the cobra-shaped scepter. The long double-edged blade at the end gleamed red as it dropped slowly downward. Jonie had time to see her whole life pass before her eyes and to say her last words. So be it. Then the blade sunk down into Jonie's gut. She screamed, blood and intestinal pieces spilled out of her mouth. She let out a long, painful sob before her eyes rolled away and her head fell back onto the wall. Mary slowly backed away, and she quickly faded into the air with a rush of ice-cool wind. The mirror fell off the wall and shattered onto the floor in a cloud of blood and glass. The funeral was scheduled 2 days from the horrid night, where 4 people Mary knew had died. Nancy, Nancy's mom, Mandy, and Jonie. Jonie was to have her funeral first. Everyone was going to be there, including Mary and the rest of the girls. The funeral would have probably been the next day, but police were investigating both Jonie and Barry's body, looking for some clue. Everything was inconclusive, though. It was the next day, and it was around 12 o'clock. School had been canceled for the day of the funeral due to the incident, and Mary was presently lying on the couch, her new bed, sobbing uncontrollably. Her family had cleared out, giving her some space. Julie had tried calling Mary's house all day, leaving sad, pouty messages. She wanted Mary desperately to call and talk to her, but Mary was coping with the deaths her own way, crying her eyes out and blaming herself. Within an hour, she was just lying on the couch, staring soullessly into the TV. All she could think about was Jonie, dead, a huge hole in her guts. Even the policeman was brutally cut in half. Soon Mary even switched off the TV, because that's all she was seeing on the news. Woman and daughter found bludgeoned with hammer and death of teenager accuser in Glenwood Springs deputy. Mary slowly slipped into depression, all messages ignored until they just stopped. Mary couldn't even get up from the couch for lunch when Mr. Jacobs called her. Mary turned over onto her side and pulled the blanket all the way over her head. There was a loud buzzing noise in her ear, like the vibrating of glass. Mary fell onto the floor, glass lodging itself into her arms, which seemed to be already cut and bleeding. With a quick spin, she was up on her feet again, and behind her was the decapitated police officer. He was smiling and pointing at her, his body hanging from a noose, looped around his broken neck. His legs were lying on the floor until they jumped up and kicked squarely at Mary's shins. Mary pushed the legs away with bloody, long-nailed hands to face the deputy. The deputy screamed and pulled out a small make-up mirror. On the surface was the name Jacobs, smeared in blood. The mirror split in half, and so did the deputy, and he shattered when he hit the floor. Mary was flung backwards until she was standing in a dark, long hallway. All along the hallway were individual mirrors hanging on the walls. Each one had a different name on it, the person's head hanging right above it. Mary continued, feeling sick to her stomach, until she reached a mirror with the blood-written name Mandy on it. Mandy's head looked down on her, gapingly, eyes twitching. The next mirror said Nancy, and Nancy's face looked the same way it did the night she died. Mary screamed, running, until Jonie's head mirror hung above her. Only Jonie was wordlessly warning Mary about something. Mary turned and ran, until she saw a mirror up ahead, with the name Mary Jacobs on it. A nail hung above it, vacant and welcoming. Mary sprinted away, stopping at the feet of a little girl, holding the snake scepter. The girl was crying and calling out to Mary to comfort her. Mary went to help her, but the girl disappeared into nothing. Mary crept away, sweat drenching down her forehead. The line of mirrors stopped a few yards away, and Mary was incredibly relieved. The hallway crept on, though, and a wall-length mirror appeared in front of Mary, and she smashed right into it. She did not feel the kind of pain she was supposed to, but she was certainly bewildered. She shook it off and squinted into the mirror. She screamed, hands wrapping themselves around her eyes. Her reflection was not hers. It was none other than Bloody Mary depicted on the glass. It was her, down to the blonde hair, blank eyes, purple lips, blue robe, and the deep cuts running across her skin like a road map. Mary opened up her eyes again, and she didn't see any kind of mirror anywhere. The hallway was plain and ordinary, no mirrors to be seen. Mary wanted desperately to leave, to get the hell out of there. She looked around one more time before sprinting down the winding dark hallway. It seemed to stretch on for miles, hours, days, until a dead end came up out of the black like the wall mirror that seemed to float in air. Mary stopped this time and desperately pawed at the wall, and crying for it to grow a door, some kind of exit. No such luck. Mary put her back to the wall and looked back at the other way, and she shuddered. She couldn't go back that way. It was not going to happen. She took a deep breath and turned back to the blockade to see if there was now a door or even a window. There was none of that, but now there was a mirror. The mirror split right down the middle and squirted blood at Mary like a water spigot. She screamed as the hallway was filled with red. Mary was swept up into the roaring flood. Mary's name was slowly spoken over the pastor's microphone, along with Jennifer's, Laura's, Julie's, and Wendy's. Mary, who was currently sweating like a pig and lost in thought, bolted up from her pew. Wendy and the other girls were now standing up beside the Reverend. "Is Mary Jacobs here?" Pastor Alderbell asked. Mary's father pointed up at the altar and mouthed, "Go." Mary nervously got to her feet and strode up to the altar. She got into the small line behind the pastor. Laura turned to her and smiled. "Do you know what's going on?" she asked, sweat dripping off her black strands of hair. "I'm just as lost as you," Mary whispered, giving Julie a small smile. Julie did not return it. "Now, Mandy's, Jonie's, and our dear Nancy's good friends will share a few words in respect." The Reverend wrapped his arm across Julie's back and pulled her up to the pulpit. "Julie?" Julie sniffed uncomfortably, her red, teary eyes glimmering in the candlelight. She cleared her creaky, phlegmy throat quickly. "Wow, I'm lost for words. It's been a very hard few months, I must admit," Julie whispered into the pastor's microphone. "I can remember the times we shared, like when we all went down to the Greenbelt when we were 7. We fell into a sticky swamp and ran away to the park because we were afraid of our punishments. We weren't found until 2 hours later. We got quite a talking to. Many parents chuckled into their handkerchiefs, including the girls, up on the altar. Mary looked around with a slight smirk on her face until her eyes rested upon Jonie's coffin, sitting a few yards away from where she stood. Mary gasped silently as Julie continued reminiscing into her childhood memories, untouched for perhaps years. No one noticed Mary step back, her eyes wide. No one noticed her mouth hanging open with a thin layer of spittle. Jonie was sitting up in her coffin, her silk dress ruffled and pasted against her pale, cracked skin. Her head was directed at the frightened Mary. One eye was pointed at Julie and one at Mary. They were fixed and bloodshot, the color of milk. Her mouth was pulled back into a scared frown, her blue lips trembling. Mary turned to the congregation, but there was no realization of Jonie's awakening. The vision was directed at Mary only. But why? Jonie was now sitting at the edge of her coffin, her lifeless legs swinging back and forth dreadfully. Jonie's face looked like a puzzle of complete gruesome displeasure and anger all at once. She spoke. "Mary, listen now!" The shaky voice, which didn't sound like Jonie's at all, made Mary jump. "Your mirror, Mary, your mirror!" Jonie whispered now, her eyes rolling back and forth like two tumbling dice. "Your mirror! Do away with it, Mary! Lock it up! Listen!" "What about my mirror?" Mary whispered, making Jennifer turn towards her. Mary did not notice. "Mary, listen!" Jonie repeated, her words not quite matching her caterpillar lips. "I am," Mary responded. Jennifer frowned and pointed at Mary after tapping Laura on the shoulder. "Our treehouse has long since crumbled, our dreams long since forgotten," Julie continued in the background. "Mary, listen!" Jonie screamed, her lips parting backwards, blood coursing out of her cheeks. "I am!" Mary screamed, the whole church turning toward her, their mouths gaping. "No! Listen!" Jonie screeched, pointing a greenish finger up at the church's stained glass window, which had a long, gnarly crack spread across it. It ran straight down the cross's picture. Now that Mary was listening, she could hear the crack slowly spreading. "Mary, are you—" the pastor began, but Mary certainly wasn't listening. Nonetheless, Mary could hear evil laughter, and it was the voices of Mandy's, Jonie's, Nancy's, Laura's, Julie's, Jennifer's, and Wendy's, all spliced together into one, which made Mary burst into tears and Jonie into a fitful combination of screams. Jonie's corpse turned a grotesque bloated blue color. Her eyes popped like balloons full of sauerkraut, and her head rolled away like a 20-pound bowling ball, rolling toward the end of the lane. Her body collapsed into the coffin in a dead clump, her legs twisting into an unnatural ball before disappearing into the casket. Mary fell to the carpeted altar, her head spinning, her body twisting. All she saw were twirls of blurry people springing towards her, helping her up, slapping her face. Mary did not fall into sleep, but into a cold trance, one of such velocity and dread that no words could describe it. But she wasn't alone. I dream in black and light. Randall, middle-aged, sits Indian-style on a dark stage with only his person illuminated in light. He is speaking into a tape recorder. Randall: I can only hope this is my last recording. It feels like I've gone through 1,000 of these tapes and I haven't listened to a single one. I guess I'm not doing this for reference. I have to get these ideas out of my head into spoken words, because that makes them real. This way they can permeate out into the universe, to be plucked up by anyone or everyone. I just like to know that I'm not crazy. If I didn't have this tape recorder, I'd just be a madman talking to myself. But if anyone is listening, I'd like to restate my assumptions here. I'm Randall, and my life is a dream. Everything about it, the car, the home, the wife, the mom and dad, none of them exist. Not really. I first realized this when all my nocturnal dreams turned lucid. I knew I was dreaming, and I could wake up on cue. Then I stopped sleeping altogether. I haven't slept in weeks, and I'm not the least bit tired. Then I started listening to the people around me. I could predict what they were going to say before they said it. I even made my neighbor disappear into a cloud of smoke. After that, I moved on to my surroundings, those little tricks of the eyes, those shadows in my peripheral. I could carry those over to my center of focus and create living projections, like people or objects. Flying through the air and stopping time was child's play. I could build a palace on the moon if I wanted. But the night I had my first real lucid dream, I was lying in bed with my eyes closed, listening to the humdrum of the waves breaking on the close cliffs of my eardrums, like the inside of a seashell. The darkness was everything but. Colors swam in the void, giving life to a pulsing sphere of energy in the center of all this chaos. Pulling endlessly to consume all form, all consciousness, so like an eye, I thought to myself, so like my eye. And I was gone. Dreams are a difficult phenomenon to define. Being a writer, I sought for a new way to comprehend my dream, to see it in a new light. but that is often near impossibility. Dreams are completely devoid of reason, which is the main faculty I utilize during the day. Yet when I go to sleep, reason is shed like a coat off my shoulders, and I am pure willpower. Anything and everything's mine. In my dream, I thought aloud. I spoke to my bedroom, in a booming voice that echoed inside my head. The words didn't seem to come out of my mouth. They came from the floor and from the walls. In retrospect, the words weren't coming from my vocal cords. These were my thoughts, without pitch or tone. Here is what I said. I want to know what my choices are. And something was there to answer my plea. The walls of my room opened up and a man joined me, arms folded. I don't remember what he looked like, only that he was young, and he had dark hair. The clothes he wore were very ordinary, much like mine. He might have been dressed in a suit, but I can't say for sure. He told me that he was going to help me without even speaking. My dreams spoke for him and took the reins for a short second. He told me that he was going to show me where I could go after I die. He knew some animals that I might consider as possible candidates. This man was my guide. He wasn't anyone I knew. Though it is random and confusing, I know what happens. Dreams are solely based on what is familiar to us. They aren't obsessed with carrying on a string of events to tell us a story we may find entertaining. Dreams are like inkblot tests of our sleep. When you glance at an inkblot, you must blurt out the first thing that comes to mind. An angel, that's a spider, a lamp. When we first begin to slip into deep sleep, our mind is a blank canvas. To start off a dream, our subconscious flicks its paintbrush and presents us a blot. Our mind then takes that splotch of paint and finds somewhere familiar to take us, and it builds from there. So for this dream, something inside me thought that the blot looked like walls, rooms, bedroom. Just like that, the setting becomes my bedroom, but what is the hook? We have an establishing shot, but where are the people? Why should we care? Everything that I associate with my bedroom, my memories and emotions, are shuffled into the back of my mind, ready candidates for what is about to take place. Invisible fingers begin to sort through all those countless numbers of cards, and they choose one. Whether the choice is random or planned, I cannot say for sure. In this dream, I don't know what card was drawn. I suppose that I meditate a lot inside my bedroom. I view it as a sort of refuge where I can collect my thoughts in peace. Here, the death card was chosen. My guide pulled me into a gray void. Suddenly, I was standing on the bed of a river. There was a waterfall somewhere upstream. I couldn't see it, but I could certainly hear it. The roar was overpowering. There were buffaloes knee-deep in the river, drinking casually, their beards dripping water. It was a family. They didn't even care that they were assembling so close to a waterfall break. Any one of them could easily topple over to their deaths, but they were not afraid. Yes, this is it, I told my guide. He nodded to me and motioned for me to join them. Before I could even step one foot into the water, a lion pulled one of the buffaloes down in a cruel splash. It was all bleeding and hair, thrashing limbs and teeth. I couldn't look at it anymore. My guide sensed my aggravation and the scene suddenly changed. With one blink of my eye, I was in a completely different world. Now we were standing on a crop of boulders. Below us, a lion was prowling under a line of trees on its haunches. I smiled at this and shook my guide's hand. I wanted to go meet the lion, but a part of me knew everything there was to know about it. A second ago, I had hated it for killing the buffalo, but now I understood. The buffalo was the meat. The lion was the hunter, and I was fine with that. That's me, I said. Nothing hunts me. My guide frowned, and I watched the lion closely. I could tell that it was starving. It had spent the last week searching for food, and the little game that it had found had gotten away. It was dying. I could not grasp this. Never before had I seen the hunter lose. The hunted was always the first one to go. How could this be? The lion lay down in the grass and did not get up. I shook my head, and the guide looked at me questionably. Where would I like to go now? Somewhere protected, isolated. Now I was standing in snow, the terrible wind hardening my flesh. There was a small animal pen set out before me. There were goats in this cage, drinking and eating from troughs. I sensed that there was a farm nearby, and these animals were being looked after. There was a barbed wire fence that circled them from all sides, and there were collars around their necks. Now this was the life, I thought to myself. These animals were separate from the rules governing the wilderness, inside their own little community. This place, in the middle of Arctic nowhere, was the most comfortable place I had been so far. Then I was aware of an opposing danger. I watched as the goats stood upright, their long necks reaching. It came out of the white storm. It was white just like everything else. It was an upright creation, gaunt and rubbery. Its hands ended in metallic blades, 3 for each wrist. This thing came at the pen with a snarl, and sliced through the fence with its scissor-like appendages. I watched as it cornered the goats inside their safe haven and tore them apart. I was no longer aware of the white backdrop. Everything was red. Suddenly I sprang into action, and I had all the strength of Superman. I was determination, pure confidence, and willpower. Knowing precisely that this was a dream, and that I could do anything, I defeated the creature, throwing it into the snow like a bundle of blankets. I turned to my guide, and he was expressionless. I nodded to him. I wasn't happy, but I accepted it all the same. Then I woke up, and I wrote it all down. This was the first dream to ever provoke that unmistakable feeling of being used. After I woke up, I felt like I had absolutely no control. I felt like I had lost my place on the planet, and more specifically, I had lost my place in nature. If I couldn't feel comfortable anywhere, where did I belong? I've come to realize that we are all out of place with nature, because nature does not care about us, and it does not give any creature any special treatment. Just because a buffalo can survive off grass does not mean it won't be killed for another lion's meal. And just because a lion can hunt down other animals for survival does not mean it is privileged with an effortless existence. In fact, there is a great chance that the lion will fail on many of its attempts for food and will starve. And even if man is to alter nature and cage his animals within his guard, nature has the ability to evolve. Like with the blade creature, and it has the ability to find its prey. The caged meal is an easy meal. Nothing is safe anywhere, not really. Nature controls us and governs us. It uses and pushes, but it never stops to pick us up and dust us off. It wouldn't even have the common courtesy to give God the floor when he speaks, or offer him a seat when he enters a room. Maybe, in a sense, I am the only privileged creature on this planet, because unlike the buffaloes, the lions, the goats, and the monsters, I am aware of how very small I am. Or maybe that makes me incredibly disadvantaged, to know that I am nothing, while still seeding for a purpose. I'm talking in circles again, but that is the curse of the writer, the thinker, the artist. To start at something beautiful will certainly bring you back to the ugly starting ground. And maybe you'll even end up with a little more material than what you started with. That's when you know you're onto something good. I've always been fascinated with the vague, unspecified images that project inside our minds like so many random slides in a show. The more I look into the complicated nature of sleep, the more these questions claw at me. Do these dreams have any significance? Are they only a composition of random thoughts and memories from the day? Or are they something more? Are they windows into our souls, or into the very future? I awoke that morning from the dream and I recalled everything, every detail. The recollection flashed incomplete and out of order. But they were there, and they told a story. Usually my dreams include people I know, or they place focus on alien bodies. Other times the men and women I meet in my sleep will be composites of people I have met before. They could be someone in one moment and then be completely different the next. Sometimes that annoys me because as a man who loves to tell stories, I believe there should be something at the start to hook you, something in the middle to reel you in, and something at the end to make you nod. There has to be something at the finish line that has you saying, okay, that makes sense. Not in a dream. I could be camping with my Uncle Hector and then suddenly he morphs into my boss, and let's say he's wielding an axe, a crazed smile on his face. Then the remainder of the dream could involve me sprinting through the woods. Everything a nauseous blur. When I chance a look over my shoulder, long behold, my boss is gone and there is a bear on my trail. Though it is random and confusing, I know what happened. Dreams are solely based on what is familiar to us. They aren't obsessed with carrying on a string of events to tell us a story we might find entertaining. Dreams are like inkblot tests. There has to be someone operating the controls while I sleep. I'm certainly not there. I'm a shadow on the canvas, on the white space yet to be touched. When my eyes close, I become the darkness, ready to open up and let something surface around me. So let's say that while I'm in the shadow, there is a little man sitting behind his desk inside my subconscious. He's an artist. He's the one holding the paintbrush and controlling my thoughts. Usually I would have access to the filing cabinets piled up in the back of my mind, but while I'm sedated, it's the artist's chance to shine. So once he has the setting and has planted a few trees here and there, he must sprint to the back and go rifling through the manila envelope labeled woods. There he finds that I cherish a lot of memories among the trees, the earliest being a camping trip I shared with my uncle when I was only a boy. That seems plausible enough, and so far everything is making sense. So the artist plants my uncle and me into the scene. I am no longer a shadow. I have blended into the colors swirling in the darkness. I am part of the work. Now that I am present inside the picture, I can take over the artist's job. Now he can sit back and relax, and I have full control of the filing cabinets. I can now take this dream wherever I want to go and paint anything that pleases me. I begin to see the painting through my eyes, so it's not like I'm watching a home movie of the camping trip. The rules still seem to apply for sleep, so it's just like being awake. We are watching everything happen with our own eye. And what is more familiar to us than that? I think that is why we don't realize we are dreaming half the time. We're opening our eyes, we're looking around, and in our sleep we think, well, I must be awake. How else could I be in the woods? How else could I be seeing this? But we are still not in our rational state of mind. Yet my dream self takes a whole different perspective. Here are where the random recollections of my day invade the efficiency of my dream and jam the gears. My dream self is now yanking open the filing cabinets, trying to find a new direction in which to take this camping trip. So far there is no rising action and there certainly isn't a climax. There are only two people sitting in the woods, looking at each other like idiots. For unknown reasons, the filing cabinet starts to rock and the files inside shuffle and reshuffle themselves. They get mixed together and the freshest memories get moved to the front. It's almost like there is a higher power involved in all of this, and it's demanding something new and different. So when my dream self goes for the envelope labeled woods, he sees that the real contents are now gone. But there isn't time to go looking for the bright memories. The dream is going on at that very moment. It is like a live show, where the producer is searching desperately for the actor's cue cards, but all he can find are the lines for the next segment. So he has no choice but to present the cards he has in hand and pray. The dream will go on with or without us, so our dream selves have to paint what they find. The freshest memory I had of that day, before my lucid dream, and before getting into bed, was work, and I was talking with my boss. He was telling me this story about a stupid argument he had with his neighbor about a borrowed axe. That is my last memory of the real world. But now I just want to wake up. But my fear is that there won't be anything to wake up to. What if this is it? What if I'm God? Why not? I'm the dreamer, aren't I? That means Coca-Cola, nuclear bombs, cell phones, and democracy were all products of my mind. Yet that's a little egotistical. Solipsistic. I think there's something much bigger channeling these ideas into my head. After all, that must be it. I have to shed my ego before I can truly wake up. That's why this repulsive light insists on blinding me. That can't be too hard. I have to see that I'm not at the center of the universe, and something far bigger exists outside me. It's weird, but I keep thinking of the Matrix. I'm on the verge of non-existence, and I'm stuck on this movie I once saw. I've tried to wrap my brain around it. I've tried to make sense. In the Matrix, bending a spoon with your mind is not in physically bending the spoon, but understanding that the spoon doesn't exist at all. Just like this tape recorder, it doesn't exist. I was talking to nobody but myself. He drops the recorder into the darkness. No, it can't be that simple. Nothing is. There's got to be something else, something listening. If not, my life would have ended a long time ago. I was never really alone. When a man believes he's alone, he expands until he fills up the entire universe, allowing room for nothing else. That was the greatest illusion. Even more so than the job or the car, I was never talking to myself. The universe is a great ear, tuning in and out of conversations. And now that I've deconstructed everything, besides me and it feels threatened. It doesn't want to be snuffed out of existence like everything else I know. That dream it sent me was a warning, and now I can hear the beast breathing in the darkness, its scissor claws clinking together as it approaches. The universe came to me in the guise of my guide, my higher power, but I'm not falling for it. I'm most concerned about its true form, that albino thing in the snow. That's what it becomes when it's cornered. And now the thing is squealing in pain, louder now. I can feel its rancid breath on my face. Tell it something interesting and wait for a response. Well, how about this? My boss actually lent out his axe to me, and he was upset because I never returned it. Why? Because I needed it for this moment now. And here it is in my hands, sharper and shinier than it ever was in reality. I am the lion, not the goat for slaughter. I'm the hunter, and because I'm the lion, I can see in the dark. I get it now. Turn the lights off. Turn the lights off, I get it. Turn them up. The lights switch off and there is the sound of metal grinding together, the grunts of a man with all of his weight directed in one forward movement, and the screech of a creature and the spill of blood. The light does not switch back on right away, but the corridors of the black, empty space are suddenly filled with the soft humming of a man, building up to the crescendo formation of a new world. Fade out. Tune in next time for Red Cave Podcast, Volume 18. Until then, guard your soul.